kleinen Riemchen hatte meine Mutter uns 8 Kinder alle auf ihrem Schreibtisch.
My mother had these pictures of us children, all 8 of us, in this little frame on her desk.
Brüder. Es waren die Großen.
First, there are the 3 brothers, the oldest children. This is Carl Friedrich, who became a professor of physics and chemistry. He was the only son who died a natural death.
Der auf natürliche Weise gestorben ist. Dies ist Walter, der mit gerade 18 Jahren
This is Walter, who fell on the Western Front in the First World War when he was just 18 years old.
Frankreich. Dies ist Klaus, der Jurist wurde, und mit ihm zusammen wurde
This is Klaus,
der Mann,
who was a lawyer. Klaus was sentenced to death, along with my sister Ursula's husband, Rudiger Schleicher, who was the head of Lufthansa.
War aber Chef bei der Lufthansa. Und dies hier ist
This is Christel, who was married to Hans von Donani. She was the only one of us sisters who was arrested and spent time in prison. She was released before the capitulation, but the whole experience led more or less to her breakdown later on.
Dann kommt Sabine Leipolz.
Then there is Sabine Leipolz, Dietrich's twin sister. She had begun a career as a violinist, so she was more in the musical line.
Angefangen, auch Goldschmied, war also sehr auf der musischen Linie. Und das ist die Jüngste, das bin ich also.
Here I am,
Susanne.
the youngest, Susanna.
Und dies ist dann Dietrich.
And this is Dietrich. His story you know.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer was born on February 4th, 1906, in Breslau, Germany. As a young man, he studied theology in Berlin and New York City. He was actively opposed to Hitler's Third Reich. At the age of 39, he was executed as a traitor at the Flossenburg concentration camp, April 9th, 1945, 3 weeks before Hitler committed suicide.
Da die Verbindung nach Westdeutschland ja völlig abgeschlossen war.
Since communications between Berlin and the rest of Germany were completely cut off, the first thing we heard, about 2 weeks after the liberation, was that my brother Klaus and my brother-in-law Rudiger Schleicher had been killed, and their bodies thrown into a bomb crater with others here in Berlin. We kept on hoping that we would have some news about Dietrich. Many people said that they had seen him. I suppose they were just trying to be friendly.
Und dann kam über den englischen Sender.
Then we were called over to a neighbor's house in Dahlem. They said that they had heard over the American radio that later in the day there would be a memorial service for Dietrich Bonhoeffer in London and aired here as well.
Zum Tode von Dietrich Bonhoeffer, und das würde übertragen werden. Und da habe ich das meinem Mann gesagt, denn die hatten mich gefragt.
I told my husband.
Damit war es ja
At this
klar,
point, there really couldn't be any more doubt about it.
Zweifel mehr.
He was dead.
So spielte man ja eben wirklich gerne noch immer mit irgendeiner Hoffnung, dass er noch mal zu uns sprechen würde.
I don't believe I cried. It was that kind of time when you just knew that you would need all your resources simply to survive.
Dass man das besser lässt, dass man davon sich nur der Kräfte begibt, die man nicht mehr, die man noch braucht. Nun war das auch nicht ganz einfach.
The most difficult thing was explaining it all to the children.
Sie alle tot sind. Und ich weiß noch, dass wie Michael erfuhr, dass
I remember when my son Michael first heard that Dietrich had been hanged. Of course, I didn't put it that way. I simply said that they had killed him. Michael cried uncontrollably. He was 9.
Es gab auch noch eine andere
We knew that this was the wall on which Canaris, Oster, Dietrich, and several others were hanged on the morning of April 9th, 1945.
In den frühen Morgenstunden des 9. April erhängt worden sind.
After the war, when I visited the camp, I climbed the backside of this rough terrain you see here. I wanted to share the last view Dietrich had taken in of this earth. Needless to say, it was a very difficult and emotionally shattering hour for me.
Hier in diesem sogenannten Waschhaus.
This is the wash house where the court proceedings took place, if you can call them that. The 4 or 5 who were taken before the court at one time here had given up all hopes of a defense.
Noch ihm vorgeworfen haben, jedenfalls hatten auch alle Leute, alle diese, es waren wohl 4 oder 5, die da auf einmal als Angeklagte standen, ihre Verteidigung ganz aufgegeben. Sie haben
Since it was clear they had nothing more to lose,
versucht,
they minced no words. They knew what to expect, the end, which for them was the beginning of life.
Und erwarteten nichts anderes mehr als das Ende. Für ihn der Anfang zum Leben.
I only heard about Dietrich's death and could be sure that that was true now in the end of July of 45. It means several months after the war had ended in Berlin.
And I didn't want to read that list, but there it was.
Yes, that was perhaps one of the most difficult days of my life. Not only that Dietrich was murdered, but it was his brother Klaus as well.
It didn't take us then, and not me, by surprise. We were used since nearly a year of death around us all day. Near friends, family members, well-known people dying.
One evening, we heard on an American radio station that Bonhoeffer had been killed. My first reaction, and that of my mother and sister, was total despair.
I can't remember exactly when the news got through to us that Dietrich had been killed, but I know that I was totally devastated by it. I thought, how in the world will we go on from here without him?
In the future, we understood that he had given us a great heritage, and we had to develop his ideas by our own activity, and not only to trust him to another person, to our master, to our teacher, that we had to stand on our own feet and to develop his ideas, what he had taught us, into life by our own ideas, by our own spirit, by our own imagination.
A few months after his arrest, Bonhoeffer sent the following message from Tegel prison to his comrades in the resistance.
It remains an experience of inestimable value that for once we in the resistance have learned to see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the excluded, the ill-treated, the powerless, the oppressed and despised. In short, the suffering. If only no bitterness or envy has gnawed at our hearts during this time, so that we may see the great and the small, happiness and misery, strength and weakness with new eyes, so that our perception of the significant, of humanity, of justice and mercy has become clearer, freer, less corruptible, so that personal suffering has become a more useful key for actively understanding the world than personal happiness. It is only a matter of not allowing these perspectives from below to become eternal dissatisfaction with us, but instead we must do justice to life and give our assent to it in all its dimensions, from a higher contentment which has its source beyond all concepts of above and below.
I think it was in May or June 44. In his letter, suddenly I discovered there was a poem. It never had been like that before. I didn't know that Dietrich was writing poems, and I am sure he had not written poems all the years before. He then wrote the letter, I feel horrible, I must send it to you, or why didn't dare to do it, and then he sent it to me. That was the first poem, and then others came. So apparently, in that time of great tension, he had the urge to express himself so personal and so concise, and sent these poems. And of course, I liked them very, very much. And it might not be the most modern, best poetry, but for me, they are the most concise, personal expressions who he really was.
Who am I? They often tell me I would step from my cell's confinement, calmly, cheerfully, firmly, like a squire from his country house. Who am I? They often tell me I would talk to my warders, freely, friendly, and clearly, as though it were mine to command. Who am I? They also tell me I would bear the days of misfortune, equably, smilingly, proudly, like one accustomed to win. Am I then really all that which other men tell of, or am I only what I know of myself, restless and longing and sick, like a bird in a cage, struggling for breath as though hands were compressing my throat, yearning for colors, for flowers, for the voices of birds, thirsting for words of kindness, for neighborliness, trembling with anger at despotisms and petty humiliation, tossing in expectation of great events, powerlessly trembling for friends at an infinite distance, weary and empty at praying, at thinking, faint and ready to say farewell to it all. Who am I? This or the other? Am I one person today and tomorrow another? Am I both at once? A hypocrite before others and before myself, a contemptibly woebegone weakling? Or is something within me still like a beaten army, fleeing in disorder from victory already achieved? Who am I? They mock me, these lonely questions of mine. Whoever I am, thou knowest, O God, I am thine.
In 1930, Hitler's Third Reich and the horror of the Holocaust still lay hidden in the future. Dietrich Bonhoeffer finished his doctorate at the University of Berlin and set his sights for the New World. He arrived in America on September 5th, 1930, for 1 year's study at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Among his newfound friends were Paul and Marion Lehmann.
He was, of course, very nice looking and very orderly and had a marvelous sense of humor and very high standards. I mean, he had no traffic. As I was saying to Paul last night after we were talking, he was very exclusive.
You had no patience with mediocrity.
He just was...
And any nonsense. I mean, intellectually, if you want to go out on the town, you know, just as with his students in Germany, you know, if you went out on a picnic or on a hike, okay. But if you're dealing with, you know, intellectual questions, then you don't mess around and no second-rate stuff. And he thought the Americans, anyway, didn't know anything about theology, and they were second-rate intellects, which the Germans always thought. But I must say there was some evidence in support of his view.
Dietrich really enjoyed America and the freedom, and he learned to drive a car here, and he loved to go to the movies. He took everything, and he was always, it seemed to me at least, gay and happy. On the other hand, you see, he was serious and very demanding of himself, too, in standards of excellence in what he did. That's whatever it was. But you never had to be afraid or wonder whether he's going to be upset or... No, his nature, to me, then, was absolutely marvelous, just like a brother in the best sense of the word. The reason why I come to love me, you'll be standing to me.
It was in this church that Dietrich Bonhoeffer entered upon what turned out to be one of the most important experiences, not only of his stay in America, but of his whole life.
Bonhoeffer became acquainted with a young black man, Franklin Fisher, a fellow student at Union Seminary. Fisher introduced Bonhoeffer to Harlem and showed him what it was really like to be born black in the United States in the 1930s. This encounter was an important influence on Bonhoeffer's growing concern for the disenfranchised and the oppressed.
They got the idea he wanted to see America and go to Mexico, of course. So he had to take the driver's license. I don't think he had driven a car. No, he had never driven a car. So he took the test, but failed. And he was crushed, of course, his German. Then he took it the second time, failed again. And Paul said, Dietrich, just give that driver who's testing you, he wants money. Just give him $5 and you'll have the thing. No, that was absolutely immoral to give that man $5. So he tried it again and he failed. So then, instead of giving the man $5, he said to Paul, he said, I'll pay your way back by train from Chicago if you'll get us that far. And by that time, you would know that he could drive all right.
Probably we had planned to take advantage of the summertime before going back to Europe to make a trip. And when he suggested Mexico, I was young, I accepted the idea with enthusiasm. He was given by a friend an old Oldsmobile, who said to him, if you can bring it back, it's okay. If you cannot, it's okay too. And I always say that the car brought us to the Mexican border, but we had to bring it back from Mexico. One of the reasons for us to go to Mexico, I spoke of the friends of Dietrich, but I had also a friend of mine. He was a Quaker, a professor in a normal school for teachers. He had invited us to come to his place, his town, Victoria, where he was professor. And he had organized a meeting without even telling us. Maybe he had written a few words about it, I don't remember. We had made some traveling, some tourism, and you see on the picture, he had rented a bus, and we had a very, very good time. But on the evening, he had announced a conference, a lecture on peace by a German minister and a French minister. And that was so unusual because it seemed to them that French and German had always been at war with one another, and it was unbelievable that they would be both on the same panel and still more speak for peace together, though France and Germany had given the impression that the main goal in life was to fight against each other. There has been a wonderful spirit in the audience, wonderful. And Dietrich spoke in a wonderful way. And probably for Dietrich it helped him to progress in the way of pacifism at that time. He discovered that such a message was expected very deeply by men on this earth, and that it not only on a sentimental and emotional way, but on a much deeper and much more serious level, that the longing for peace is a duty for any man who respects himself.
When Dietrich Bonhoeffer came back from his year in the United States, he was now entitled to teach at Berlin University, that famous place of all great liberal theology, and there he started. But soon the students apparently noticed that this young man was not the normal teacher they were used to.
He was not the German professor, the German university teacher, as we had in other cases. The teacher was up there and very high, and we were the students down there, and there was a very great space between us. But he always became our friend, and he was not only teaching us, but he was talking to us and had a lot of time for us.
There were very good theologians in Berlin, but they were more of the academic variety. In Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I found a man who took up the burning issues of the day and who gave the impression that his vision was turned to the world and not merely to the church and its history. He didn't have a large following. He was still very young and not yet well known.
In those days, when he thought that the danger of the time was the new nationalism in Germany and in Europe, and new militaristic spirit in Germany and in Europe, maybe all over the world, then the testimony of someone who belongs to the body of Christ is to work for peace. And I think that was his first great theme for his young life. Being a Christian means to work for peace.
Hoping to use Hitler to smash the communists and control the labor unions, a group of wealthy industrialists met secretly with President Hindenburg. They persuaded the president to appoint Hitler to office. On January 30th, 1933, the unbelievable happened. Adolf Hitler became the Chancellor of the German Reich. 4 weeks after Hitler's inauguration, the Nazis burned the Reichstag, the parliament building in Berlin. A young Dutch communist, Marius van der Lubbe, although innocent, was indicted for the crime and executed. Exploiting the fear of a communist takeover, Hitler then persuaded President Hindenburg to invoke a series of emergency laws for the protection of people and state.
There we read the restriction of personal freedom, of the right of speech, including the freedom of the press, of the right of association and of public assembly, intervention in the privacy of post, telegraph and telephone, authorization of search warrants and the confiscation and restriction of property beyond the hitherto legal limits will henceforward be admissible. Actually, this Hindenburg edict was the basis which affected Dietrich Bonhoeffer later on very personally. It was that kind of edict which was brought as reason when the Gestapo closed down his Finkenwalde seminary. It was that law which made possible all the concentration camps from the beginning of 1933 up to the very end, a concentration camp in which Dietrich himself was then murdered in Flossenbürg at the very end of the war.
The government's first official act against the Jews was a one-day boycott of Jewish businesses on April 1st, 1933. Although pickets were posted in front of all stores, factories, and shops belonging to the Jews, Bonhoeffer's grandmother, Julie Toffel, walked through a cordon of SS men into a Jewish department store and made her purchase.
For 50 years, and I'm not about to stop now.
But she said she was not going to be told she couldn't go inside because the owner was Jewish, so she walked right in and bought the strawberries. And nothing, of course, happened to her. They didn't dare take this elderly woman, and she was very alert and, you know, could walk elegantly, and so nobody was going to stop her, and they didn't stop her.
A major matter in our conversation at that luncheon that day in Wangenheimstrasse was about ways of providing emigration for the Jews, because Klaus and Dietrich were very convinced that this was the beginning of a more systematic persecution, and that they were very convinced that a major responsibility in the Humane Society, not to mention the Christian responsibility, in which Dietrich was interested, Klaus wasn't, but they agreed on this point, that the major responsibility was to prevent this kind of fierce scapegoatism of the Jews.
In this situation where the government of a state is not protecting anymore one group of society, or is permitting violence against them and all that, and making that law. Yeah? He says there are three possibilities of actions for the church. The first, the church must ask the state whether it could answer for its action as legitimate political action. Second, Bonhoeffer says, the church has an unconditional obligation towards the victims of any social order, even where those victims do not belong to the Christian community. Third, he says, the church's responsibility is not only to bind up the victims beneath the wheel, but also to put a spoke in that wheel if need be.
I think we have to keep in mind, first of all, that for Hitler, the church was in itself a foreign element, he could never accept the God of the Bible, the God of the Christian Church, because he was himself a God. And the German nation was a godless for him, and blood and the German soil and German history and the German Empire and so on, and his own power was his godness.
The Nazis in the church, or the German Christians as they called themselves, had been trying to gain power since early April. On July 23rd, they won the recently instituted church elections and secured for themselves key positions in the church government. In due time, they began to introduce Nazi ideology into church doctrine. Thousands of pastors all over the Reich objected. Bonhoeffer urged this essentially conservative group to make their opposition active and visible. He urged them to refuse to officiate at funeral services, even to go so far as to resign their positions. To Bonhoeffer's disappointment and frustration, his proposals were considered too radical, too political, and were dismissed. The opposing pastors instead opted to draft a new confessional statement, hoping to force the Nazi leadership of the church to declare its own future confession, teaching, and action.
We have to challenge now the power holders in the synods and in the offices of our churches. We have to challenge them what they are now going to preach, whether they will change the gospel and Nazify the gospel itself, or whether they will preach the gospel of the New Testament, Jesus Christ. And for that, they set up a small commission, and the main persons were then Dietrich Bonhoeffer and a friend of his, Lutheran Hermann Sasse, who had moved to Erlangen, to the Bavarian Lutheran faculty there, and they both were commissioned straight away to go to retreat for a month and write a kind of new confession, what the content of the gospel, the content of the church, where it's for, that they had to write down this kind of confession. And later on, what the result, which came out of that rather happy work they did together there, was then called the Bethel Confession. And there he wrote a letter to his grandmother to Berlin, where he describes a little bit what he happened to see there and what he was doing there. He writes, "Our work here is very enjoyable, but also very hard. We want to try to make the German Christians declare their intentions. Whether we shall succeed, I rather doubt. For even if they admit the formulations officially, the pressure behind them is so strong that sooner or later it is bound to sweep away all promises. It is becoming increasingly clear that what we are going to get is a big, popular national church whose nature cannot be reconciled with Christianity, and that we must be prepared to enter upon an entirely new path which we shall then have to tread. The real question is between Germanism and Christianity, and the sooner the conflict comes out into the open, the better. Nothing could be more dangerous than its concealment." End of August, they had finished, had given it to the leadership of the young reform movement, and they distributed it then to all the professors around and hoped they would give their statements, their comments to it. But the result was, as Dietrich had already hinted in the letter, was disappointing. And at the end, many of the decisive paragraphs, which were so decisive for Dietrich especially, were then watered down, that in the end Dietrich refused to sign it. And I think that was one of the last reasons that after that Bethel time, he considered suddenly to go away. So he had the feeling, what's the use of me to fight further on in this way? And he accepted then an offer to take over a very small little German-speaking pastorate in London. And so he went in October to minister there.
On August 2nd, 1934, President Hindenburg died. Hitler now combined the two highest offices of the country in his own person. This also meant that he was now the supreme commander of the armed forces. Before the end of the day, every serviceman in the country had sworn a personal oath of allegiance to Adolf Hitler, Führer, Reich Chancellor of the German people. In late summer, Bonhoeffer attended a meeting of the World Council of Churches in Denmark. Deeply aware of the rising tide of militarism in the world, Bonhoeffer challenged this international assembly of church leaders to accept its responsibility to be daring in the cause of peace.
Our task as theologians consists only in accepting the commanding of peace as a binding one, not as a question open to discussion. Peace on earth is not a problem, but a commandment given at Christ's coming. He who questions the commandment of God before obeying has already denied him. There is no way to peace along the way of safety, for peace must be dared. It is a great venture. It can never be safe. Peace is the opposite of security. To demand guarantees is to mistrust, and this mistrust in turn brings forth war. The hour is late. The world is choked with weapons, and dreadful is the distrust which looks out of all men's eyes. The trumpets of war may blow tomorrow. For what are we waiting? Do we want to become involved in this guilt as never before?
And I think we must understand his speech and his message as a call to the church to take a prophetic position, stand, and saying, now we shall not go to war. We must find another way to solve our problems, but anyway, God forbids waging war, and there will be no solution, real solution of our problems, if we follow that road.
I think that was the same day after that sermon Bonhoeffer gave in the morning. Our group was on the beach and Bonhoeffer came to us, and then a young Swedish minister asked Bonhoeffer, Dr. Bonhoeffer, you spoke about peace and war and about the peace testimony of Christians. When Hitler will go to war and call you to arms, can you tell us what you personally will do? Bonhoeffer remained silent for a long while and played with his fingers in the sands, and then he faced the asker and said very, very slowly but very convincing, well, my dear friend, I hope that God in that case will give me the power not to take arms. All of us knew what that meant. That meant that Bonhoeffer said he could face death. Then in the Hitler government, in the Hitler state, the possibility of consensual objection was absolutely impossible. Everybody had to be killed who denied arms. And everybody was very, very deeply impressed that Bonhoeffer not has said, I will do, but he said very reluctantly and very, very hesitantly, I hope that God will give me the power.
Violently opposed to the tyranny of the Hitler regime, Bonhoeffer now faced the personal decision of how best to resist. His thoughts now turned to the East, to India. He was interested at this time in Mahatma Gandhi's experiments in spiritual community, passive resistance, and nonviolent opposition. However, his plans to visit Gandhi in India were not to materialize. For by this time, the opposing pastors in Germany were gaining momentum. Since the seminaries of the official church were now imbued with the ideology of Nazism, the confessing church set up seminaries of its own. Bonhoeffer was called back from his ministry in London to be the director of one of these seminaries in the north on the Baltic Sea.
Ja, da ist doch Bonhoeffer. Ich sag, Bonhoeffer ist doch in London. Nein,
No, they said. The Confessing Church has given Bonhoeffer the assignment of directing the first seminary for its theology students in Zingst.
I was not a Berliner. I was a country boy from the province of Saxonia near Magdeburg. And my church in the province of Saxonia had just happened to send me to that new seminary. I didn't know who the leader was. I had never heard the name Dietrich Bonhoeffer in 1935. So I went in the evening, in the end of April, I arrived there, and the majority of the candidates from other provinces were already there. We altogether were at the end 25 candidates. I looked around now, where's the director? And then someone playing with the others in the evening at the dunes, at the beach of the Baltic Sea, doing some sport there. They said, oh, this he is. And he didn't look very different from the candidate who was just 3 years older than I was in those days. And then they told me, oh, he was already a teacher at Berlin University. He has written already some books and he knows everything. And he's one of the most radical fighters for the Confessing Church. Of course, that pleased me. But then I didn't know what he was really like. And then I remember how I was surprised when he took a little walk with me together on the beach and asked very personal questions about my last month of service in a congregation already and what my family was like. And he seemed really to be personally interested in me, and that pleased me very much.
Und kam gerade Ende April dorthin und erlebte
I arrived at the end of April, just in time to witness the May 1st celebrations there. When the Führer, damn him, announced in his May Day speech that compulsory military service was being introduced.
Nearly all of us, like me, country boys, we were rather pleased that Hitler announced that, because we came from fighting in the church struggle already, having been accused in the congregations and in the papers as being unpatriotic, fighting Hitler's policies in the church and being made unpatriotic Germans. And we didn't want to be that. We wanted to be patriotic Germans as well. And so we thought having the opportunity to serve now in the army was an opportunity to show all the public that we were patriots ourselves. And I remember very well seeing Dietrich sitting in the corner there, listening as we did to that speech. And when that portion came, that he showed all signs of being sorry, being angry, and not at all enthusiastic as we were. And I was very surprised what a Lutheran pastor, a Lutheran minister, being educated to be a good German, to be a good patriot, how could he react like that? And so we asked him, and in the evening he agreed to discuss the question. And that was the first time I discovered that that man, the leader of the seminar, had pacifist thoughts. Incredible as a good Lutheran.
Ja, und dann haben wir dort am Strand gelebt.
So we lived there on the beach at Zingst, in barracks. As you probably know, more sand than anything else.
Wir hatten nur unsere Bibeln, sonst keine Bücher.
We had our Bibles, otherwise no books.
Mit dem Tageslauf.
The daily routine was totally alien to us. We were asked to take a Bible text and meditate on it for a whole week. Of course, we hadn't the slightest idea what that was, meditation. So we sat around in the sun, some smoking, some in bathing suits. And Bonhoeffer left us alone for at least 10 days doing this. Then we had a meeting in which everyone told about what he had experienced. Most reported having a lot of trouble concentrating. It's one thing to read a Bible passage for a while, but then you start thinking about all kinds of things, about this person and that person. At this point, Bonhoeffer spoke up and said very quietly, that's just exactly what should happen. You can't help but be led to thinking about others, but then bring the others back with you and include them in the text and pray for them. But it gradually became clear that we could not stay in Zingst. We heard that there was a private school that had been vacated in the town of Finkenwald. It had apparently been abandoned and was filthy, they said. What had been the gymnasium was made into our makeshift chapel. It was beautifully done. We had an artist from Berlin who made a beautiful figure of Moses, or was it David, and put it up there. There we held regular services, and before long some townspeople were coming to worship with us, people who then became members of the confessing church. The local pastor, you see, was a German Christian, and had at times made it difficult for us.
We looked on the one side to the river Oder on the many water arms, and on the other side the hill went up, and there was a big, lovely forest of oaks and elms and linden, a wonderful countryside. So we had great music. Dietrich was a great pianist, and some others were too, and so they played on two pianos the great concertos of Bach, or some of the concerts of the piano concertos of Beethoven, the one taking the orchestra part, and others. And in the same room, of course, Dietrich first time was showing us his records he had brought from New York in 1931, and I remember I had never heard before about the Negro spirituals, and Dietrich showed them to us and let us listen in, and soon after a few days, all these Paul Robeson voices were being heard on the floors of the Finkelwalder house. Everybody had learned now Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and we found that the Water Boy, and we found that great. Everybody knows it now, but that was absolutely new for us.
Wir hatten in dem Semester bei Bonhoeffer Auslegung.
That semester we worked on exegesis of the Sermon on the Mount. Later on, he worked this into his book, The Cost of Discipleship.
Und sind aufgrund dieser Auslegung
It became clear to us on the basis of this Bible study that it is not possible for Christians to justify killing, nor to justify war.
Das Töten zu rechtfertigen gibt, also auch nicht eine Rechtfertigung des Krieges.
So, of course, we also had to talk about the very immediate question of what we would do if it came to war, or even if it didn't come to war, what we would do if we were drafted, since the draft had been introduced.
Denn die allgemeine Wehrpflicht war ja da, und wir waren die Jahrgänge, die dann...
We were just the age that would be taken first. We worried, because we didn't think this through all that carefully, because there was so much else to be concerned about. There was the question of the church and the Jews and our work in the parish.
Frage der Kirche und der Juden und unserer Gemeindearbeit. Aber als es dann soweit war und wir eingezogen wurden, ich wurde am 15. Mai 1939 eingezogen.
When it came to the point that we were, in fact, drafted, I was called up on May 15th, 1939. We went in with a bad conscience. It was against our convictions, but the alternative was being lined up against a wall and shot. I remember that when it came to the outbreak of war on September 1st, 1939, I was still hoping that the confessing church would come out with a loud no, but by then it was no longer in a position to act at all.
In September 1935, the Nuremberg laws for the, quote, protection of citizenship and race, end quote, made anti-Semitism official German policy. These laws robbed the Jews of their German citizenship and deprived them of their basic human rights. 3 months later, on the 2nd of December, the state church announced that all seminaries of the confessing church were now illegal.
And in the evening of the 2nd of December, Bonhoeffer asked us to come together, and he said, well, the time is extremely critical for us, and if you want to leave the seminary, I will give you all the liberty to do so. And nobody wanted to go.
Hilfest von Schanden, rettest von Banden, wer dir vertrauet, hat wohl gebauet, wird ewig bleiben. Halleluja.
Now in 1937,
That was the year when the confessing church had most of its prisoners. Dietrich and I had just closed the 5th course in Finkenwalde and went down to South Germany and had a nice time in the Alps. And then we got a telegram on the 28th of September telling us that the Gestapo had appeared in Finkenwalde in our big house there and had closed it down. The eldest brother of Dietrich was a little bit afraid that Dietrich could do something too radical, which would challenge the Gestapo to do something against he himself. Already 800 pastors had been in prison, and so apparently he had written to Dietrich, shouldn't you think it over again and think on mother and father? And in those days, Dietrich wrote back, Dear Karl Friedrich, I'm sorry if mother is upset and is making others uneasy too. There's really no good reason for it. The fact that I may fare just as hundreds of people have fared already through Himmler's edict really must not worry us any more. To hold out on the church question means sacrifice. And why should anyone want to dissuade us? None of us is keen on going to prison. But if it comes to that, then we shall be ready to go. I hope so anyway. As the cause is worth it, we start again at the beginning of next week.
On March 12, 1938, Germany annexed Austria. In celebration of the Anschluss and as a birthday gift to the Führer, the state church ordered all pastors to take a personal oath of allegiance to Adolf Hitler.
It is hereby decreed, anyone who is called to spiritual office is to affirm his loyal duty with the following oath. I swear that I will be faithful and obedient to Adolf Hitler, the Führer of the German Reich and people, that I will conscientiously observe the laws and carry out the duties of my office, so help me God. Anyone who was called before this decree came into force is to take the oath of allegiance retrospectively. Anyone who refuses to take the oath of allegiance is to be dismissed. Dr. Werner, who was at the head of the state church at this moment. It is understood that the German Christians happily took the oath, but even the majority, I'm sorry to must say it, even the majority of the confessing pastors took the oath because they believed that Lutheran Christian had the duty to obey the state, and they took Dr. Werner as somebody who asked this oath in the name of the state.
On November 7th, a young Polish Jew whose parents had been expelled from both Poland and Germany shot a German diplomat in Paris. Hitler seized upon this event as a pretext to launch his first full-scale assault on the Jewish people. On November 10th, 1938, the Nazis destroyed and looted thousands of Jewish shops, homes, and synagogues. The riot would be remembered as the Crystal Night, or the Night of Broken Glass.
The brown shirts would assemble and burn the synagogues and smash the windows of people in Jews in Jewish shops, and some bring to concentration camps, and there were some killed, but it was not the order to kill them, but to bring them to the point that they would sell all their property very cheaply and leave the country. Yeah. And this was the most visible act after the boycott on the 1st of July 33 again, something, and on 3 days, and the police stood by, didn't help them when there was something going on. Dietrich in those days was not in Berlin, and in that little village in back Pomerania where we were, of course, we did hear only late through the radio, didn't see anything. And of course, he was very much shocked. And he had his Bible for his prayers and meditation, yeah. And just on Psalm 74, where it says, "They speak in their hearts, now let us plunder them, let us burn them. They burn all the synagogues, the houses of gods in the country. Our signs we did not see. There was no longer a prophet. There was nobody among us that knew how long. How long, O God, shall the fool blaspheme?" And then, look here, Dietrich on the 9th of, on the 9th of November, there in his pencil, 9/11/38. And here, making an exclamation mark on that, yeah, which shows that on that very day he heard it, he was just meditating that, reading that psalm, yeah. And the candidates were just discussing whether this has to do with a kind of curse on the Jews, which was the usual way Christians reacted, and Dietrich said no. And then he wrote a letter to the candidates, to the former candidates, a circular letter, mentioning this, that he was thinking of that. And during the past few days, Dietrich writes, I have been thinking a great deal about Psalm 74, here, exactly, there it is. Zechariah 2:12, he who touches you touches the apple of his eye. And Romans 9:3, Israel, to whom belongs the sonship, the glory, the covenant, the law, the service, the promises. And Romans 11, that takes us right into prayer, Dietrich continues. So at that moment, he was not in the midst of the affairs, but already thinking, as not many pastors and churchmen would think, that touching the Jews means touching Christ as well. For Dietrich, the year of 38 was so disappointing on all fields, in the ecclesiastical field by his own church, taking that oath of allegiance to Hitler, and that greatest defeat in the history of the confessing church in his eyes. And in addition to this all, of course, the problem came that his draft was just coming, and the decision to serve or not to serve was then in the air. He had managed to get an invitation to come to New York and to teach there, and so he decided and managed, through help of his father and other friends, to get the passport and to get the visa. And so he left us, and he promised, "I will prepare for you too, that you come over too." So we didn't know what to think, and as the story goes on, we will see how he experienced his arrival in the safe country, where he had opportunities to study, to teach, to write as he pleased. That apparently was not possible for him.
June 12th, 1939. Arrival in New York. The Reverend Mr. Macy from the Federal Council of Churches greeted me on the quay. June 13th. The first lonely hours are hard. I cannot make out why I am here, whether it makes sense, whether the result will justify itself. Nearly 2 weeks have passed now, without hearing anything from over there. I can hardly bear it. June 14th. It poured with rain in the night. Everything is fresh and cool. Then prayers. The short prayer, in which we remembered our German brothers, almost overwhelmed me. I shall probably not stay here very long. July 1st. I have had time to think and to pray about my situation and that of my nation, and to have God's will for me clarified. I have come to the conclusion that I have made a mistake in coming to America. I shall have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share in the trials of this time with my people. Christians in Germany faced the terrible alternative of willing the defeat of their nation in order that civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying civilization. I know which of these alternatives I must choose, but I cannot make that choice in security. July 7th, last day. Paul tries to make me stay. No longer possible. 11:30 farewell, 12:30 departure. Manhattan by night. It is very hot. My inner uncertainty about the future has ended. The journey is finished.
Though Dietrich was from the very beginning convinced that Hitler has to be abolished, sagt man das? He felt that's not his business as a theologian. But when he came back from America and learned what has happened meanwhile in '39, with the Jews' persecution especially, and political nonsense which was going on, which had to lead into the catastrophe. And then he had discussions with his sister Christine Donani and his brother-in-law Hans von Donani, and with his brother Klaus, my husband. And as more he heard, as more he himself felt that he couldn't stand aside, but he has to give his possibilities, which he had through his international contacts through churches, to help to bring the matter forward. And that was rather problematic for him and costed him a hard work. I remember that I told him, wie ist das eigentlich mit euch Christen? Selber wollt ihr nicht töten, aber wenn es ein anderer tut, freut ihr euch, oder wie ist das? I asked him, how is that with you Christians? You will not kill, but that another one does it, you agree, and you are glad about. Huh? How is that? And then he said, one shouldn't be glad about, but I understand what you mean. Es geht nicht für einen Christen, dass von anderen verlangt, dass sie sich die Hände schmutzig machen.
It is out of the question for a Christian to ask someone else to do the dirty work so that he can keep his own hands clean. If one sees that something needs to be done, then one must be prepared to do it, whether one is a Christian or not, if one sees the task as necessary according to one's own conscience.
Hat auch mal ein anderes Bild gebraucht. Hat gesagt, wenn ich sehe,
later on, he used another example. He said, if I see that a madman is driving a car into a group of innocent bystanders, then I can't, as a Christian, simply wait for the catastrophe and comfort the wounded and bury the dead. I must try to wrest the steering wheel out of the hands of the driver.
I have to try to get the Steuer out of the hands of the madman, yeah. That's the way he came into the conspiracy. It's not a break in his life that he was first a pacifist and first a pious child and then a helpful young man, and later on suddenly he became a politician. It's a quite clear line going through. The situation changed and the tasks changed that came to him down.
The chief aim of the conspiracy was the overthrow of the Hitler regime and the establishment of a new government. The center of the resistance movement was, ironically, Hitler's own military intelligence organization, the Abwehr. Since the Abwehr was a military unit, Bonhoeffer was, as a matter of course, exempt from the draft. His chief mission for the conspiracy was to seek peace terms with the Allies, which would be implemented should the overthrow of Hitler be successful. He was stationed at the Benedictine monastery in Atal, where he awaited assignments from the resistance headquarters in Munich. It was at this time that Bonhoeffer began writing his book, Ethics. In this work, which remained unfinished, Bonhoeffer boldly assessed his church's share in the national guilt.
The church was silent when it should have cried out, because the blood of the innocent was crying aloud to heaven. It has stood by while violence and wrong were being committed under the name of Jesus Christ. The Church confesses that it has witnessed the lawless application of brute force, the physical and spiritual suffering of countless innocent people, oppression, hatred, and murder, and that it has not raised its voice on behalf of the victims and has not found ways to hasten to their aid. It is guilty of the deaths of the weakest and most defenseless brothers of Jesus Christ.
When I was in the States, and I had to speak about the Hitler time and the SS trials and the German people and all these things, I often in the discussion afterwards, I was asked, but if you knew so much about, why didn't you tell you? Everybody in Germany today says we didn't know about. And you knew about, why didn't you tell about? Why didn't all these people who knew about didn't tell? And then I mostly tell this experience which I had when, I forgot when it was, maybe in 42 or so. I was standing in the line and we were waiting an hour or more until the car with the vegetables came, and of course we talked together. And then I said that now in the concentration camps they started to kill the Jews in masses. And they even made soap out of them. And then my neighbor said, Frau Bonhoeffer, you shouldn't tell such fairy tales, such atrocity stories. This is propaganda against Germany that cannot be true. And I said, well, you can believe me, it is true. Where from do you know that? I know it, that's enough, and you can trust me. And then the shopkeeper cried aloud, Frau Bonhoeffer, if you don't stop to tell these stories, you will end in a KZ too, and nobody can help you. We have heard what you have said. And said, well, it is the truth and you should know it. And when I came home, I never was denounced. Nothing happened about it. When I came home, I felt a little bit proud about my courage and told my husband what I had done. And his reaction was very depressive for me. He said, it's absolutely idiotic what you are doing. Please understand, a dictatorship is like a snake. If you put your foot on its tail, that's what you are doing, it will just bite you. It doesn't help anybody. You have to meet the head. And that's what you cannot do, and that's what I cannot do. And therefore, the only thing which makes sense for us to do is to inform and to convince the highest generals that they have to make the coup d'etat. We have to inform the highest generals, because in Germany, in Prussian Germany, Prussia Germany, nothing will function if it doesn't come from above to lower. And the people in America understood, because they never have experienced dictatorship. And they cannot understand why it shouldn't be possible to tell things which are true. You see?
Nearly all my school days were spent in the Hitler time. Since so many of the students in our class at school were Nazis, we got used right away to the fact that we couldn't always speak the truth.
Wir waren schon sehr früh als Kinder davon unterrichtet, dass
As children, we were taught very early on how dangerous it was to talk to strangers about political things, at least in the same way in which politics were discussed at home.
Das war mir auch klar durch die Gespräche.
How dangerous it really was clear to us just through the way in which the adults carried on political conversation in, for example, my grandparents' house. They would usually sit very close together in a circle whenever they discussed politics. And every once in a while, someone would get up and see if anyone was listening at the door. Sometimes, of course, they would whisper because they were afraid someone might be eavesdropping. And then they weren't sure if perhaps the telephone was bugged, so they always put a pillow on that to make sure nothing got out.
Dann war man oft auch nicht ganz sicher, ob vielleicht in dem Telefon irgendwie eine Möglichkeit wäre, abzuhören. Dann wurde ein Kissen aufs Telefon gelegt, um ganz sicher zu sein, dass also da nichts rausgeht.
So that it was dangerous to talk politics was clear to us very early on, actually from the beginning.
Deutlich, eigentlich von Anfang an. Nachher später wurden wir selber dann öfter rausgeschickt.
Later, even the children were sent out to check the doors, especially when we were 13, 14, or 15 and were allowed to listen to the news broadcast over the BBC at my grandmother's house.
Die englischen Nachrichten manchmal mithören durften bei meiner Großmutter.
My grandmother never missed the BBC broadcasts once during the entire war. She even had a code word for this. Shortly before 10 o'clock, she would always say, "Oh, now I must go to my devotions." Of course, everyone in the family knew what that meant. And if we went along with her, we would occasionally be told to check the door to see if anyone was there. Because if you were caught listening to the BBC, you could actually have lost your life. It was really very, very dangerous.
Das konnte einem das Leben kosten. Das war verboten und das musste...
In these same days, with that tension and race, Dietrich, by going again and again to Pomerania, writing on his ethics in the house of Frau von Kleist in Beck, Pomerania, he met that young girl, Maria, beautiful, and suddenly fell in love. Didn't dare first to approach her during the winter. He did so, and in January, so near to the danger point, they engaged to each other. It was not announced publicly. The mother didn't like that, her mother, because such a young girl being married to a pastor like that, who was in such dangerous position, you didn't know what he really was doing. But when Dietrich was imprisoned, then in the family at least, it was announced. But the tension, the expectation was still heightened and more hot when then in March all the preparations for the coup d'etat were really seemed to be on the goal, when on the 30th of March Schlabanov placed that bomb in the airplane of Hitler. It didn't explode, it failed, 1 week later, they tried that again in that museum, and again, Hitler didn't appear at that point where he was supposed to be caught by that explosion. The whole preparation fell flat. Brauchitsch, or General Beck, the head of the conspiracy, the head of all the preparation, fell ill, was to be operated, and at the end of March, the news came there might be more danger in the air for Hans Dohnányi. On the 30th of March, the whole family of Dietrich celebrated with great joy in Berlin the 70th birthday of Dietrich's father. And then on the 5th of April, the Gestapo came and the prison began.
Dietrich war nach dem 20. Juli, es war, glaube ich, schon im August, nach der Prinz-Albrecht-Straße, dem
When the July 20th plot failed,
KZ, könnte man sagen, oder Gefängnis, verlegt worden.
Dietrich was moved into the terrible SS prison in the Prinz-Albrecht-Straße, and no visitors were allowed, so we didn't see him during this time.
In der Prinz-Albrecht-Straße durfte ihn niemand besuchen, sah ihn niemand mehr.
Then, on February 3rd, the day before his 39th birthday, our parents were going to try one last time to visit, but when they left the house, we were hit by a huge bomb raid, the worst we had experienced.
Am nächsten Tag,
the next day, another member of the family set out for the Prinz-Albrecht-Straße, but found that the prison had been hit and that Dietrich was no longer there. His fiancée, Maria von Wedemeyer, then set out on her own, going from one concentration camp to another, to no avail.
Die kam nicht durch. Schließlich musste sie diese
Finally, she had to give up her search to help her own family, who had by then fled to the west. After this, total darkness fell over all our loved ones in prison or concentration camps.
Stretched out on my cot, I stare at the gray wall. Outside, a summer evening that does not know me goes singing into the countryside. Slowly and softly, the tides of the day ebb on the eternal shore. Sleep a little, strengthen body and soul, head and hand, for peoples, houses, spirits, and hearts are aflame. Till your day breaks, after blood-red night, stand fast.
It was quite an experience when I one day understood or discovered that that clever, intellectual, always dominant person had such periods of depression that suddenly everything he believed in and he could do and became meaningless for him. And one day then he turned to me and asked me to listen to him. And I felt first really rather helpless. I didn't expect it that way, but I had slowly to learn that a man like him had these depressions. And I discovered that was not in times when there was defeat around, when something didn't go like he would have liked that it should go, but just in times when his superiority was so clear, when everybody believed in him, looked at him. In prison later on, he expressly wrote to me in his very first letter that the time of these accidia or tristitia, what the German religious word says, Anfechtungen, that you are attacked by the devil of nothing, that he was spared of. Now, there was so much purpose in the last years of his life that he was not given over to these periods of depression anymore.
Dear Eberhard, I want to assure you that I have not for a moment regretted coming back in '39, nor any of the consequences either. I knew quite well what I was doing, and I acted with a clear conscience. I have no wish to cross out of my life anything that has happened since, either to me personally or as regards events in general. And I regard my being kept here as being involved in the part I had resolved to play in Germany's fate.
Und als ich ihn das letzte Mal gesehen habe, das war im Sommer 1943.
The last time I saw him was in the summer of 1943, shortly before his arrest.
In Berlin.
I visited him in his home in Berlin while I was on leave from the Russian front.
Wieder zurückgehen nach Russland in Urlaub.
I was wearing an officer's uniform, since I was just on my way back. I was wearing the Iron Cross medal. I was terribly ashamed, because I had an idea of what he was involved with here in Berlin. I knew nothing for sure. He didn't even tell his closest friends anything about the conspiracy activities. But then he asked me, in utter sincerity, without any judgment, how I had earned my medal.
Ich konnte nur antworten, das weiß ich nicht. Das ist so eine Routine-Sache.
And all I could do was mumble that I didn't know, that it was merely routine. It was then that my wish, my desire was strengthened, to will only one thing, to survive the war and see to it that such a thing never happened again. The reason I tell about this is that through the pacifism that Bonhoeffer had taught us, that we had come to by reading the Bible, the will to resist fascism and dictatorship had been planted so firmly in me that these 7 years as a soldier were utter hell for me. Sometimes I was close to insanity because of it. At any rate, the only thing I could conclude for the rest of my life was never again.
I discovered later, and I'm still discovering right up to this moment, that it is only by living completely in this world that one learns to have faith. One must completely abandon any attempt to make something of oneself, whether it be a saint or a converted sinner, or a churchman, a so-called priestly type, a righteous man or an unrighteous one, a sick man or a healthy one. By this worldliness, I mean living unreservedly in life's duties, problems, successes and failures, experiences and perplexities. In doing so, we throw ourselves completely into the arms of God, taking seriously not our own sufferings, but those of God in this world, watching with Christ in Gethsemane. That, I think, is faith, and that is how one becomes a man and a Christian. How can success make us arrogant, or failure lead us astray when we share in God's sufferings through a life of this kind?
When the assassination attempt, the 20th of July in '44 happened, I was with my children in Holstein, with relatives. I went for Berlin to look at my husband and my brother and brothers-in-law and what will happen. And I found my husband sitting on ruins of a house, just having a pause between working out some things to save them from the cellar, from the ruins. And he saw me, and we were sitting on the stones. And we didn't speak much. And he felt, no matters will run. It's lost, everything is lost. I forgot if it was this occasion or later when he came in August to see the children for the last time, when I asked him, when you will be arrested, what can I do? And he said, you can't do anything. It will be as if I fell in a lion's den. Try to save your life for the children, and you will get help from friends. I have to go my way, But I feel at least my children will never have to be ashamed about their father that he had knew about and hadn't done anything.
Und das ist ja das, was Bonhoeffer am meisten auch bekannt gemacht hat, das für die anderen da sein und vor allem
being for others.
für die sonst niemand da ist.
This is something Bonhoeffer is particularly known for. Above all, being there for those who otherwise have no one to be with them. To cry out for all the disadvantaged people in the world. To be the church, not in such a way that it fights primarily for its own survival. Unfortunately, this is what we in the confessing church did almost exclusively. But Bonhoeffer was one of the few in the confessing church who always saw the whole picture. Above all, he saw Christ as the brother of all persecuted human beings, of all people tortured and made victims of others.
Sache, die ja für uns heute nicht weniger wichtig ist als für damals, im Gegenteil, die immer wichtiger wird.
See what a transformation. These hands so active and powerful now are tied. And alone and fainting, you see where your work ends. Yet you are confident still, and gladly commit what is rightful into a stronger hand, and say that you are contented. You were free for a moment of bliss. Then you yielded your freedom into the hand of God, that he might perfect it in glory. Come now, Queen of the Feasts, on the road to eternal freedom. O death, cast off the grievous chains, and lay low the thick walls of our mortal body and our blinded soul, that at last we may behold what here we have failed to see. O freedom, long have we sought thee, in discipline and in action and in suffering. Dying, we behold thee now, and see thee in the face of God.